Hey there, art nerds. Welcome to another watercolor tutorial and art chat. So today I'm going to be walking you guys through the process for this camping trip illustration. This thing ended up taking forever, about a week and a half to paint, and that's not including the drawing and composition time. And I had to kind of double edit it to get it small enough that I could actually get it in under an hour. So please do not let this trick you into thinking art is fast. Sometimes it's fast and sometimes it takes a really long time to complete, but hopefully the results are worth it, and hopefully you guys will enjoy hanging out with me today and talking about watercolor and art. We're starting with a penciled but not yet stretched watercolor illustration. I transferred my digital sketch onto this using my blue line printing technique. I'll link that for the description for you guys below. And then I penciled on top of it. I have a few tutorials on my stretching process, so if you guys are curious about learning more about that, I'll be sure to link that in the description for you guys as well. It is a beautiful Louisiana summer day today, so I am doing my narration outside. So you're going to hear birds, you're going to hear airplanes, you might even hear my AC unit kicking on, but it's just so beautiful I couldn't bear to sit inside. So I am using a hake brush to apply my water to the paper. I'm also using a spray bottle. I've just found that using a spray bottle to apply water first and then applying a layer of water with the hake brush and removing the excess with Viva paper towels just works best for me. I'm using 3M's low tack blue painter's tape. This is not the foam tape, this is the crepe paper tape, and it's about an inch and a half wide, and this is something that I've used time and time again. You guys see it in a lot of my videos and it works really well for me, but as always, it's a your mileage may vary sort of situation. If you are using something else and you'd like to recommend it, please do let me know down in the comments below. I have stretched this. My support is Chloroplast or plastic Gatorbard. This has worked well for me over the years. You can also use wooden lap boards, you can use chipboards, basically whatever works well for you. My only complaint about the Chloroplast is that it sometimes takes longer for really saturated watercolor paper to dry because the plastic kind of traps the moisture in. I haven't found that it affects the watercolors themselves negatively, it just increases my dry time. So if you have something that works a little bit better but doesn't lose its shape as you're stretching and painting your watercolors, let me know about that as well. I'm always on the lookout for ways to up my watercolor game. So today I am painting with my Daily Driver watercolor palette. This is the palette that I use for everything, and it is pretty humongous. It's also full of convenience colors. And one of the things I really wanted to make sure I got in early on is I really wanted to create some atmospheric lighting and some atmospheric framing with this illustration. So if you guys look really closely, you'll notice that there's kind of a frame around our tiny campers of grass, of leaves, and there's even a mouse peering over the grass. So this is Kara and her family and Tanner going camping way back when Kara was a little kid. So I wanted to use color to help push that framing, and I wanted to start that in early on. So I did kind of a reverse of atmospheric perspective. So generally with atmospheric perspective, you'd have your yellows and your warmer colors as your foreground colors and your blues and your cooler colors as your background colors, but you can kind of flip that on its head and use it to create dramatic lighting and dramatic staging or a dramatic frame. So I have my cool blues around my foreground. That's going to make everything kind of seem like it's receding. It's going to have it in shadow, and it's going to really push the focus on the things that are the warmer, brighter colors like our yellows. So I'm using the blues to frame the yellows, and that's going to help pull the attention. Now, just to make it a little bit more fun, to make it a little bit more lively, I did some splatter techniques, some wet into wet techniques, and I'm really going into this with the atmospheric framing. Honestly, and I make these kind of comments a lot when I'm doing my narration in post, I probably overworked this piece. It's so much easier to see when you overwork something when you're watching it in time lapse like X16. So, you know, this is something that's good for me because it gives me a chance to critique my work and learn from my mistakes after time has passed and my brain is actually receptive to critique. So that's a great opportunity to talk a little bit about critique, both self-critique and soliciting critique and offering critique. So generally it is considered just kind of rude to offer unsolicited critique. You never know what mindset the artist might be in. They might be aware of what you're saying and it's a mistake they can't fix, or they're not going to do it again next time, or they're planning on correcting those things. So in general, it's good form to wait for someone to ask for critique. If you've got a burning suggestion and you just can't bear to wait, or if you can see that they're heading off a cliff and you want to help stop them from driving off that cliff, you can always ask if you can offer a little bit of critique, or ask if you can offer a suggestion. If they say no, you got to respect that. That is their agency. That's their choice as the creator. And if they say yes, then that's your opportunity to offer some advice or some insight. And I generally try to frame it in a positive way, an improvement focused way. I find that I'm most receptive to that kind of critique, and that those I teach are most receptive to that kind of critique. Now, if you have to critique yourself, if you don't have necessarily people that you trust or people that you're that close to, or you're under a time constraint, I find that for giving yourself self-critique, time is a great way to get some clarity, to get some perspective, and to be able to look at your work and find things you liked, things you would do again, and things that you would change in the future. So for me, recording these time lapses and narrating on top of them is actually a great opportunity for me to learn from my work. I also record a lot of what I'm painting, and taking photos as I'm working on it, especially at stages where I really like how it looks, is a great kind of scrapbook reminder of things that I might want to revisit in the future in a different piece, maybe handle the technique differently, or allow that technique to shine a bit more. So, the hindsight is 2020 is definitely true for art. The more we draw, the more we paint. That's why things we did 5 years ago might not look so good, because we've gained all this perspective. We've gained all these new skills. So giving yourself a little bit of time between when you create something and when you decide you want to critique it and learn from it is really beneficial. Now, if you don't have 2 weeks to let it sit, then just giving yourself an hour and then coming back to the piece with an improvement mindset, with a critique mindset, can be a great way to come back to your work when you have a limited amount of time and to be able to reassess it and to make improvements. Because it's all about, so when you're painting, when you're drawing, you're in one type of mindset, you're in a creation mindset. But when you've taken a break, you've stepped away, and then you come back to it, you can decide to be in an improvement mindset, or in a critique mindset, or in a critical mindset. So it's about kind of giving yourself the space to change what frame of mind you're in and to change what mode you're in and come back to it. And generally when I'm self-critiquing my work, and I often will write critiques and things I could improve upon, things I want to refocus on as I'm working on a piece, I keep either Post-it notes or a notepad doc up on my computer with those kind of reminders for me. I will write those. So generally I like to paint in the evening. When I'm finished painting for the night, I'll take a bath, and then when I'm finished taking my bath, I'll come back in, I'll kind of look at the piece, and I'll kind of think about the piece, and that's when I make my notes. So I've taken 30 minutes, I've read some comics, I've listened to some music, and I'm in a different mindset. I've gotten a little bit of distance from what I'm working on, so I'm able to come back with a critical mindset and look for things that I would do differently, things I want to tweak, things I want to adjust, colors I want to shift, or things that I want to bring into focus more. So that is seeking, and if you want to seek critique from others, I would recommend you find, it doesn't actually have to be other artists. Some of the best critical critique I get is from my husband. He loves me, he wants me to improve, but he does not mince words. And if he doesn't like how a piece is going, he'll be honest and say it's not really working for him. So sometimes the people who are best able to offer critique are not necessarily fellow artists. In fact, sometimes fellow artists don't always offer useful critique because they might be afraid of offending you, or they might be afraid of hurting your feelings, or they might just not have anything particular to say about the piece at the time because they're busy juggling their own stuff. So it's beneficial, if you can, to solicit critique from people who appreciate art, who appreciate your art, and enjoy the kind of art you make in general, even if not necessarily yours, but the same type of art. They need to be receptive to the kind of art you make in order to offer some really salient critique. But you can also get some really interesting insight from people who are interested in totally different things. So what's most important, in my opinion, is to solicit critique from people you trust and people who have your best interest and your growth in mind. And that's not always telling you everything you want to hear and being super encouraging. That's being honest with you and ideally offering suggestions on how you can improve. So I find that it's really helpful to solicit critique from artists as well as from non-artists as well as from myself, and just kind of merge the three and try to grow from there. So once I kind of finished painting in all my light, I started blocking in my foreground frame using cool blues, and I used phthalo blue and I used indigo blue. And once I did that, I started working on kind of painting the image in the frame. And for this piece, I wanted to work with two kind of distinct color palettes. I wanted to work with warmer colors for the characters and for the background, the area being framed. And I wanted to use cooler colors, a lot of blues, a lot of greens, for the framing imagery. And that's going to create kind of two planes of vision. That's going to create some depth for us. And it really doesn't have to get super complicated to create depth by having two kind of different color schemes that work well together. So in this instance, the warmer yellows, the lighter colors versus the cooler blues and greens, you can easily create that depth. So at this point, to kind of help avoid confusing myself, I decided to focus on rendering the actual image, the thing being framed, where I want you guys to focus. I'm going to work on rendering that first, and then once that's moving along, I'll kind of shift to our frame, because while our frame is important, it's not as important as the area of focus. And as I've talked about in some of my other watercolor chat videos, you don't necessarily want everything to have the same level of detail. You don't want everything to have the same level of focus, because then it becomes confusing to the viewer what's actually important. And part of the storytelling for an illustration like this is discovering other things in the illustration beyond your immediate area of focus. So that's why I hid a few insects in there, I hid a frog in there, I hid a little mouse in there. So right now I'm kind of just rendering the ground, the dirt that they're walking on, and I'm using a lot of wet into wet techniques for that, and just kind of building up those colors, because right now I know I want kind of a reddish brown dirt, sort of like you get in Mississippi or in Alabama. That's going to feel warmer. That's going to kind of help pull the focus, because we're going to have that contrast between our red and the greens, the lush green foliage. But I'm not yet sure how dark I want to go with that. And I'm using kind of a stippling pattern to create the impression of loose dirt or looser dirt, not necessarily hard packed dirt. And for this illustration, particularly with the frame, as I added my layers of blue, things started to be kind of difficult to see because I penciled this first. If I had inked it first, it would be a lot easier to see what the individual elements are, but that might have drawn too much contrast, and I didn't necessarily want to do that. So I left it penciled so that we could have kind of a more storybook, more picture book sort of feel for this. I find that when I do inked illustration, it tends to feel more like my comic work, which is great, which is also kind of ironic because I pencil my comics, I don't ink them, but it has that like black line harsher contrast that reminds you that you're looking at a piece of art, or a graphic piece of art, I should say. And I don't mean graphic in the sense of it's, you know, violent. I mean graphic in the sense that it is a graphic, that it is an illustration. Whereas when I do penciled illustrations, they tend to have a softer feel. It allows for kind of a more dreamlike feel. You don't have necessarily that harsh delineation between the black ink and whatever colors you're painting. But the pencil does have a tendency to get kind of lost in the illustration. So what you guys don't see is that I had my initial digital sketch up in Photoshop on my computer screen, and I was referencing that as I was painting the foliage, particularly as I'm really going in and rendering the foliage. And I mean, you don't have to paint things exactly as you drew them. Don't feel the need to do that. But it does help to have that as a reminder in case you start to feel like you're getting kind of lost. Now, that wasn't an issue really for the characters being framed, the more important part of the illustration, but I didn't want the thing to just kind of fall apart and turn to mess on me. So I did have that up in the background. So utilize whatever references, whatever tools you need to make your illustration successful. So I'm using a lot of phthalo blue to help me kind of render in the individual blades of grass. I want them to be a lot lighter than the frame, but I also want them to kind of fade up into the background frame because this is a wooded area. I have the base of a tree with the roots somewhat visible in the background. It's hard to see because there's a lot going on, but once I flip it over again, you guys can kind of see the tree there. So this is kind of a shady wooded area, and I wanted the grass to kind of recede into that. I didn't necessarily want a harsh delineation between the background grass and the frame. I mean, I wanted it to not all meld together, but I didn't necessarily want it to be like green grass and then dark blue leaves, if that makes sense. So often with these illustrations, I'll kind of paint what I know. I'll paint the foliage first. I'll create the impression that I want to create using lighting and mood. And then I'll decide what the characters are wearing based on the color scheme we've got going. I'll either go with something that complements the color scheme or clashes with the color scheme. And I talked about this a lot in my How Does Your Garden Grow video, where I'm painting a Lilliputian watering her garden. I'm often torn between what works from a storytelling point of view for this particular illustration versus what actually fits the world building narrative I'm creating with 7-inch Cara and Lilliputian Living. And that's often a difficult dichotomy for me because you've got the difference between an illustration that's part of a long series of illustrations designed to tell a story versus a single illustration that's designed to capture the attention and the imagination of a viewer as a standalone thing. And as someone who creates art on YouTube, that's really a struggle because I'm not just creating, most of the time, I'm not just creating pieces for YouTube. I'm creating pieces that I'm going to sell at shows or that I'm going to include in the book. So they have to work for my other things, but I do want to use them to attract a larger audience, to attract more fans. So it both needs to fit the world building of the existing story, and it needs to be attractive and appealing. And bright colors are very attractive and appealing on YouTube, and muted colors tend not to do as well. So when I'm painting these illustrations and I'm deciding on the clothes that my characters are wearing, well, in 7-inch Cara, Lilliputians typically wear faded, more muted colors that can be achieved from natural dyes or fabric scavenged from humans, so stuff that they've already thrown out. It's really rare for them to wear bright, eye-catching colors because that catches the attention of predators, it catches the attentions of humans, and they really want to blend in with their environment. But that is not very interesting from a standalone illustration perspective. So every time I'm recording something like this and I'm going to share the finished illustration on social media, I'm always torn between, do I want to do what makes sense for the world building in the story that other fans of Lilliputian and Tiny People stories will appreciate, or do I want to go with something that's cute and eye-catching and possibly attract a larger audience and possibly get them interested in the stories that I'm telling and the work that I'm creating? And it's always a juggling act, and I can't necessarily say that I feel like I figured it out 100% by any means. But one of the really exciting things is that I'm always learning new things almost every time I paint. I'm always trying to push myself to do new things, try new things out, take different risks, use different framing. So even if I'm not there yet, I feel like I'm making a lot of progress. And I feel like with these longer standalone illustrations that don't necessarily do so well here on YouTube, I do feel like I am learning a lot. So I wanted to create the impression of dust motes in the air, and I'm kind of doing that in two different ways. I am using a more opaque yellow and splattering it on, and that's going to come later, but I'm also using splattered masking fluid to reserve some areas so we get some different tones in the background. So at the time I was painting this, I was seeing a lot of trust the process coming up on Twitter, where other artists were talking about how they were going through the ugly phase of their work, whether it was thumbnails or they were writing or it was like the middle of the illustration, and that it's important to trust the process. And I am of two minds for that, because when I'm painting Caran pages, I do tend to use a very regimented process generally, and as someone with ADHD, I really appreciate the structure and the stability that it offers me, because by having those confines, I kind of know what to expect and I can predict things and I can plan my time accordingly. But for these sort of standalone illustrations, I like to break the process so that I can learn new things, because if I'm always doing the same process, I'm not learning new techniques, I'm not learning new skills, I'm never leaving my comfort zone. So while in general, I do think trust the process, particularly if you're in the middle of working on your comic, is great advice. I'm not ragging on that at all. And having a process that you know, that you understand, and you can rely on to give you certain results is, I highly recommend you develop that, because once you have your rules, you can break your rules and you can learn new things and you can try new things. But the whole trust the process thing was not necessarily working for me for most of this one, because I was trying out a few different things, a few different techniques, and I was also bringing in things from some of the other illustrations that I've painted recently, like How Does Your Garden Grow and the Spring Greens illustration, where we have a lot of like negative painting and wet into wet color blending and just a lot of green going on, and then we've got like a pop of contrasting color to help the viewer focus on the important subject matter. So I was also trying to like reference those and remind myself that even though I am trying some different things with this one, there is still a process for this, and as long as I stick with it and I have faith in it and I have faith in myself, I'll see the end of it. And that's also something that I really do struggle with, to be quite candid. I do have confidence issues. I have confidence issues regarding my art. I have confidence issues regarding my place in society and my value as a human. And I do think a lot of artists struggle with this. So I'm sharing this not for pity, not fishing for compliments, but if it's something you're struggling with, please know that you're not alone. And it makes it harder for me to advocate for my art and to advocate for my knowledge and my skill set with this kind of burden on my back, which means it can be harder to trust myself and to trust the process and trust that I know what I'm doing. And this isn't something I've always struggled with. When I was younger and in more of a student role than I am now, I could rely on, well, I'll improve someday. I have time. As long as I'm putting in the time and studying, I'll get there eventually. And I'd actually like to return to that mindset, because I think it was a healthier mindset for me than kind of where I am now. So it's kind of about reframing things and changing how you perceive the world. And that is actually something I really love about art and illustration, is that it is a way of seeing the world, a way of interpreting the world and analyzing the world and depicting the world and sharing your worldview with other people. So one of the things I wanted to capture with this illustration that I don't necessarily feel I was as successful as I would have liked to have been is that dappled light effect. That's something that honestly I feel like I over render everything, and if I kept my watercolors really light and kept my layers really light, you might see more of that dappled effect. So see, that's one of the pros of rewatching this and kind of reanalyzing and criticizing my own work in a growth mindset, is that I'm like, oh, wait a minute, I think I know how to fix that. I'm going to do another illustration later on where I do fix that. But one of the things that's really important for me is, and this ties back in with trusting the process versus not trusting the process, is I don't want to just always do things by rote. I want to think, especially for standalone illustrations where I'm actually trying to learn something new and trying to do something new and trying to stretch myself, I want to break that comfort zone. I want to try different things. I want to make mistakes. I want to learn how to fix those mistakes if possible. So just trusting the process and just being like an old horse walking to the stable isn't going to enable me necessarily to grow the ways I want to grow. So I think both are very valid. I think when you have a a 1,000 page watercolor comic story to tell like I do, having that set process is very freeing because it allows you to actually focus not on developing your comic process or your painting process, but on your storytelling and the story you want to tell and actually getting it done. But when you're doing standalone illustrations that are not necessarily part of a series, it can be good to kind of adopt a new process, to try different things, and to really leave your comfort zone. So I see the appeal of both. I think both are useful, and it's just harder for me to kind of switch that mindset. And that's actually one of the ways I think my ADHD negatively affects my work, is that if I'm being distracted while I'm painting, I will just go into the same old habits I've always done a million times. And then I wonder why it looks like all the other pieces I've ever painted, and it doesn't necessarily look like something new, or doesn't necessarily reflect what I wanted it to reflect. Because instead of trying something new and seeing it through to the end and thinking about it critically, I end up falling into my old habits, which aren't necessarily bad habits, but I'm looking to expand my tool chest. So by relying on the old tools I've always known how to use, I'm not learning how to use the new tools, which might serve me better. But you know, when I'm really in flow and I'm able to take good breaks and I'm not necessarily having someone else distracting me with important questions that I really should be focusing on, like house hunting questions, I am able to paint new things and try new things and see growth and see change. So I'm not saying it's an impossible thing for me. I'm saying that someone with ADHD who knows she has ADHD, this is an area I have to be careful about, because if I'm painting comic pages and I'm always mixing skin tones the same and I'm always painting clothes in the same kind of shorthand way, I can kind of be distracted. It doesn't really matter because I know what I'm doing. I've done it 1,000 times. I know how to get to the end. But if I am trying to learn something new, it's like you're taking a new route home. You have to pay attention so that you don't make a wrong turn, or you don't end up just going the same way you always do because you weren't really paying attention to it. So once I kind of had all the larger areas blocked in, and that's something I always try to do, is I try to block in and render, maybe not to full detail, but any of my really wet into wet or my larger areas, I try to get those done early on and try to get those done first. And then I can kind of focus on the smaller details and refining things like painting the skin and painting the clothes, that sort of stuff. So that's where I'm at now with this. And I have done so many tutorials where I kind of walk you guys through painting people. I don't necessarily want to get into that too much with this one. I will link a bunch of those down in the description below. I really hope you guys will check those out. I worked hard on them. I'm pretty proud of them. So if you're looking for more, I definitely have you covered down in the description below, or you can always request that I cover that during one of my Power Hour live streams. I am in the process of moving right now, so I am unable to live stream for the time being, but once I'm able to pick that up, I am sure I'll be looking for some ideas that you guys are excited about, because the best live streams are when y'all are excited about it and I'm excited about it and we're just having fun and hanging out together. Those are some of my favorite. So what I decided to do for their clothing for this illustration is I decided to pick color schemes for each of them so that they could stand out as distinct characters and not necessarily really worry about them blending in too much with the background. So the father figure, Rowan, that's Kara's dad, he is coated in oranges and browns. Kara, the little girl with the pigtails, she's coated in reds and pinks. Tanner, the little boy across from her, is coated in yellows and ochres and browns. And Meldina, Kara's mom and Rowan's wife, is coated in pinks and purples. And those are warmer colors that are going to kind of pop off the background, but they're not like, I could have gone with opera rose and that would have just stood out way too much. That would have been like, eat me, eagle. Oh no, I said yellows for Tanner, yellows, ochres, and greens. So I wanted to go with colors that would kind of pop from the background, that would draw the viewer's attention while still somewhat staying within the realm of the world building that I've been developing for the past several years. So this scene takes place several years before 7-inch Kara actually starts. This is when Kara's a much younger kid, and she and her friend are being taken camping by her dad. I thought that would be a really charming idea because Kara lives in a dollhouse, and I thought it would be fun to kind of depict what Lilliputian camping might look like. But if you're interested in learning more about these characters, in learning more about the Lilliputian world, and in checking out more of my art, it would really mean a lot to me if you went over to 7inchkara.com and read 7-inch Kara. It's available as a webcomic, or if you're a fan of the Dead Tree format like myself, I am a collector of books, you can purchase volume 1 and volume 2, and that both of volumes have a lot of extras that I never shared online. You can purchase both volume 1 and volume 2 out of the Natto shop at nattosoup.com/shop. I'll link both of those down in the description below so you can find them. If you're just interested in the Lilliputian world in general, I have this great illustration and prose standalone book, Lilliputian Living. It's the compilation of 4 years of October inked zines. So if you're interested in like tabletop gaming, role playing, and storytelling, and you're looking for a unique world to set your characters in, to set your adventures in, you might want to give Lilliputian Living a shot. It might provide plenty of inspiration for your own storytelling adventures. So there is a lot going on in this illustration, and it really took a while to paint, especially because I'm painting in Southeast Louisiana during hurricane season, and even though my AC was running full blast and I have a whole house dehumidifier running, y'all, it is humid and paint can take a really long time to dry, especially because I really slather on a lot of paint and water in the early stages. So it definitely took some time and some patience. Good things take time. Well, not always, but sometimes it's really fun to just do really quick watercolor sketches that are simple and yet immediate. This one was not one of those though, but I still did enjoy painting it, even though there were a lot of times where this was starting to feel like it was just a slog. It was starting to feel like I would never finish it, and there was a lot of times when I felt like I was just kind of meandering around painting the same things over and over and over again. I don't know if you guys have fallen into that, but that was definitely something that was going on here. I think I spent too much time fiddling around with the frame, with the grass, with the leaves, and while I spent an appropriate amount of time painting the people, I feel like it just kind of dragged on longer than it really needed to because I was being too fussy with the foreground elements. But you know, you gotta make mistakes to learn from your mistakes. So I'm using some indigo to really start creating some darker kind of verdant green shadows. I'm also using indigo as a glaze on top of the characters because I'm really big on my characters looking like they belong in the environment, looking like they're part of the environment, and that means having the local light and the local shadows, the local color affecting their color as well. It's just so satisfying for me to be able to paint people who feel like they're part of that world and who feel like they're part of that scene. And that, honestly, when you're painting from imagination, that is quite a challenge. And one of the ways I recommend improving at that, and that's something I should focus on more, is painting from reference. After I move, I really want to set up different colored lights and practice painting some everyday household objects underneath those lights so I can really study how different lighting situations affect different colors, affect different objects, affect different textures, and affect the shadows that are cast. The one thing that kind of bugs me about this, and it's why it's not really good for a straightforward tutorial, is how much I've had to time-lapse this to get this in a viewable format. In fact, I know 45 minutes is really kind of pushing it for most people. Most people do not feel like watching a 45-minute video on YouTube, but they'll hang out with me for 3 hours during a live stream. So go figure. I get that though. When I watch YouTube, I like to have it on in the background while I'm doing other things. So as long as the conversation is good, I don't really care how long the video is. But I wanted to get this video under an hour. I felt like no one was really going to watch it if it was a super long video. So I'm a little annoyed at just how much I had to crunch it down because it kind of makes it impossible to learn at a granular level for something like this because everything's moving so fast. But it is a good opportunity to kind of talk about things on a macro level to talk about art philosophy, to talk about illustration philosophy, to talk about how I think about approaching things like this and some of the macro techniques I take I utilize while I'm painting something like this. So I get asked about those weird red caps on my brushes a lot. That is part of a brush hanging system that allows you to hang your brushes brush in down when they're drying, so they actually dry to a point instead of bushing out. I really like it. It's probably going to end up in my, I don't know, 2021 of 2021 or 20 of 2021. I don't know. I always do a year in recap of my favorite art supplies and materials, and there's been a lot of them this year. This has been a good year for art supplies, but this one is probably going to end up in that. All right, so once I finished, for the most part, with my watercolor, once it had a chance to dry, I bust out my watercolor pencils. There are 3 main brands, maybe 4 main brands I like. I like the Caran Museum Aquarelle, I like the Caran Supracolor 2, and I like Derwent Inktense watercolor pencils. And please do not at me that Derwent is not technically a watercolor pencil because it's made of India ink. I know. And I have found that as I progress with watercolor, I am using watercolor pencils in general less and less for just general local color and more for adding back in lighting, adding in some small rim lighting details, and adding in some shadows that if I were to do that with watercolor, it might turn the colors kind of muddy. That's also one of the reasons I do a lot of grise or underpainting techniques, is I find that it allows me to add local color, to add shadow in ways that would have turned to mud if I tried to glaze it on top of what I'd put down to begin with. So I'm mainly using the watercolor pencils to help pull some delineation into the grass. So I'm adding a little bit of yellow to the tips of the grass in the foreground, just to kind of help make it pop a little bit more, help create some depth, help create some framing, because in order to create shadow, it does help to have some light. I'm also using the yellow and the white to add some rim lighting to the leaves, so they're not just this mass of leaves and you can't really tell what they are. And I'm using the white and the indigo to add some light and some shadow to the characters and to just help pop things a little bit more. And one of the things I really like about watercolor pencils over color pencils is that you can use a little bit of water to activate the watercolor pigments in watercolor pencils, and you can blend them out. Now, the problem with Derwent Inktense regarding that is the color tends to be way more intense after you've activated it with water. So it can sometimes be more than you really bargain for. Another thing about Inktense is once it's dried, it's going nowhere because they're using India ink particles. So that might be a plus for you. That might be something you really like, especially if you really struggle with your watercolors reactivating and turning to mud. There are a few brands that do India ink watercolors, like Derwent does India ink watercolors and Faber-Castell does India ink watercolors. So that could be a good solution for you. But for me, I do find it a little frustrating just in terms of color control, and sometimes the colors are quite drastically brighter, more saturated, and even just different when they're wet and then they dry, when they've been activated and then they dry, than they would be just as, you know, a dry color pencil. I'm also kind of redrawing some of the clovers down at the bottom, just to add a few more layers, to add in some more details, and to just add some additional interest. So when you see me pull out the white gouache, you know that the illustration is just about done. And that's even true for such a large, time-consuming illustration as this one. It just means I'm going to spend more time with the gouache than I would on a smaller, simpler piece. And mainly, I'm just using it to add in some highlights that I might have missed, or were not quite as bright, or were not quite as clean as I was able to achieve with the watercolor pencils. Because when you're using watercolor pencils on a really textured paper, and in this instance I am using, I want to say, Moulin de Roy cold pressed cotton rag watercolor paper for this, so it does have a pronounced texture, and you are going to get some speckling with your watercolor pencils. So gouache is a good way to kind of go in and make sure you get like that really nice tight line that doesn't have any speckles, that doesn't create any visual noise. we are just about done. All that is really left is to remove it from its constraints, to remove it from its Gatorbard. So if you have watched this far, good job. You have watched way further than most people. Most people get like 9 minutes into my videos and then they're like, no, this is way too long. And then they peace out, which is kind of a shame because there's a lot of good stuff in the middle when we're just talking about art and illustration and making art. So as always, I pull away at a 90-degree angle. For this one, the tape had sat on it long enough that it was a little more challenging to remove. It didn't tear the paper, but it does require a little more patience and just kind of going in there and peeling it away carefully. But it does a pretty good job of holding the paper secure and not allowing it to buckle too much without tearing the paper. And there we have it. Our camping trip watercolor illustration is finished. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with me. This one was really a journey. It was a trip in and of itself. It took about a week and a half to complete just the painting, but we've got a lot of color and a lot of depth going on. I really like this illustration and I had so much trouble scanning it. So the scanned illustration looks pretty different from the watercolor illustration just in terms of color depth and adjusting things for vibrancy and so that it looks better on the internet. But hey, that is one of the challenges that traditional media artists frequently face, which is why I think the digital versus traditional debate is kind of funny because a lot of traditional artists use a lot of digital techniques in their art, and most of us do not think ourselves any better or any different than our digital art brethren. I like to think that the two disciplines are just different techniques and you use what you use to get the job done because it works for that particular job. So I don't necessarily believe in a whole lot of elitism when it comes to art supplies, and art techniques. Use what works for you, and if it doesn't work for you, try something different. I hope you guys enjoyed hanging out with me today. I hope you guys enjoyed the tutorial aspects of this. I hope you guys enjoyed the chat aspects of this. If you learned something, I would really appreciate it if you let me know down in the comments below. It would really mean a lot to me, and it would also help me figure out what areas you guys enjoy and what y'all might like me to focus more on when we do these chats. If you enjoy tutorials like this one, if you want to help me create more of them, I still will create them, but it certainly helps offset the cost if you guys join me over on Patreon at patreon.com/natosoup. For just $2 a month, you get early access to my videos, you get backer exclusives to all kinds of things, and you help me create tutorials like this one as well as art supply reviews. So your support over on Patreon really does help a lot, and it doesn't take a whole lot to join the community and support what I do. So I want to thank you guys so much for hanging out with me. Huge thanks to these patrons here, and I'll see you guys again soon. Have a wonderful day, guys. Bye.